Good afternoon. I'm Dan Benjamin. I want to welcome you to this Dickey Center event on mobilizing allies for women, peace, and security. Notes from the field. I just want to begin by saying that I know that for those of us who use the words peace and security with any frequency, it doesn't seem at the moment like we're having a lot of luck these days, especially if you think about yesterday's events and the Iran nuclear deal. But every once in a while you get lucky. I feel that we're pretty lucky to have 6 or 7 people here to hear this talk on a beautiful day in Hanover when most of the Upper Valley is out on the green, or listening to a talk from a Nobel laureate on the subject of are we all really made of quarks? But it's true, every once in a while you do get lucky. The Cubs won the World Series, Leicester City won the Premier Cup, the Premier League, and the Dickey Center got Don Steinberg to spend a term here as this year's Alan Bildner Distinguished Fellow in International Affairs. And I want to thank the Bildner family again for their generosity, which made this year's visit by Don Steinberg and last year's by Johnny Carson possible. Anyway, I knew I'd gotten lucky when I called Don last fall looking for his thoughts on who he might recommend from the policy world who could come to Dartmouth and teach a seminar on poverty alleviation, and he said, "How about me?" I knew I was doubly lucky when he announced that he wanted to give public talks on genocide and on women, peace, and security, a subject we've been promoting at the Dickey Center since I first arrived many, many years ago. Don Steinberg brings more than 35 years of experience in government and non-governmental organizations and expertise in the fields of international relations and development. He is a special advisor to World Learning, having served as CEO of the organization from 2013 to 2017. Before that, he was deputy administrator at USAID, where he focused, among other things, the inclusion of women, people with disabilities, LGBT persons, and other marginalized groups in the development arena. Previously, he was Deputy Press Secretary for National Security Affairs at the White House, National Security Council Senior Director for African Affairs, Special Haiti Coordinator, U.S. Ambassador to Angola, and the President's Special Representative for Humanitarian Demining. He was also Deputy President for Policy at the International Crisis Group. He has a particularly long history in the area of gender and development and gender, peace, and security. He was named by President Obama as a U.S. representative to the UN Commission on the Status of Women. He was a board member of the Women's Refugee Commission. Indeed, he was the first male board member. He was a member, or is a member, I should say, of the UN Civil Society Advisory Group on Women, Peace, and Security, and a senior advisor to the UN Women and Institute for Inclusive Security. Have I garbled that? No. Oh, okay. It only sounded like one. He's been recognized for his work in the field with a number of awards, including the Leet Award of Interaction for the Advancement of Women, the State Department's Hunt Award for promoting women in policy formulation, and the Futures Without Violence Global Impact Award for outstanding achievements to end violence against women globally. Don Steinberg is the author of more than 100 articles on foreign policy, African development, gender issues, post-conflict reconstruction, children in armed conflict, and disarmament. He holds degrees, master's in journalism from Columbia, and in political economy from the University of Toronto, and a BA from Reed College. He has many more awards for his diplomatic work, and I could recite them all, but then we never get to hear him talk. So with that, let me turn over the microphone to you, Don, and thank you very much for doing
it. Thank you, Dan, and thank you all for coming. This is a difficult day in terms of what Dan was referring to, but it's also a positive day in one other sense. I don't know how many of you noticed, but there were 19 women running in open primaries for the House of Representatives yesterday, and 16 of them won. It's a new era, and I'm excited about seeing the number of women in our political system rise from the 19.3% in our House of Representatives right now to a representative group. I wanted to talk today about an initiative that is underway that I'm very excited about. An initiative related to broadening the tent for advocacy on women, peace, and security issues. 6 weeks ago, on March 23rd, we brought together representatives from 70 different international agencies, governments, NGOs, women's rights groups, foundations, and universities in New York City on the margins of the UN Commission on the Status of Women. And this is the group of all the organizations that we convened at that point. The organizations included the ones here, UN Women, Women Waging Peace Network, Ford Foundation, Carter Center, One Earth Future, U.S. Institute of Peace, and Women, Peace, and Security Institutes at a dozen major U.S. universities. We were as diverse as our nationalities, but we were joined by one common concern, and that is that the systematic exclusion of women from global peace negotiations, peace-building missions, and post-conflict reconstruction and reconciliation is a violation of basic human rights. It is a sad reflection on the unfair and unequal gender distribution of power. But it's also a key reason why most of these processes fail. Indeed, 66% of all processes that do not involve women fail, and 2/3 are more likely to fail if they do not involve women. We saluted the great organizations who have done research in this agenda over the past couple of decades. And we shared empirical evidence of the challenges of getting women to the table. And in particular, we noted that over the past 25 years, there have been 300 peace agreements. Only 1 of 13 participants in those negotiations have been women. Only 6% of these agreements address gender-related issues like sexual violence. And the peace processes, again, that do not include women meaningfully are 2/3 more likely to fail. Our specific concern in March at our meeting was how to broaden the tent to advocate and engage senior leaders more effectively. In particular, we were addressing our concern that while there have been many men who are supportive, and there are some groups that have stepped forward like He for She, the Men Engage Alliance, and Promundo, the collective voice of men has been largely absent. A groundbreaking report from Our Secure Future last October lamented that while men still dominate leadership roles within national and international security structures, they have remained on the sidelines of women, peace, and security movement. The idea for an initiative to add the voices of men to this advocacy was first surfaced at Georgetown University a few years back with Secretary Hillary Clinton, with Ambassador Samantha Power, Deputy Secretary of Defense Michelle Flournoy, and Ambassador Milan Vivir. And if you're a little confused, I'm the bald guy at the end there. So the meeting that we engaged in was on the role of gender and peace. And we got off the stage and we came back to the back room, and Secretary Clinton turned to me and said, "Don, 85% of the audience were women. Where are your men?" And I felt like all women must feel when they're the only representative in a room and are asked to represent their entire gender. After a follow-up meeting that we held at the Woodrow Wilson Center, we formed a steering committee with representatives from 10 countries. And following a period of consultations, listening tours, and mobilization, we brought together the steering committee to develop the meeting in March. And I can go through these individuals if you wish, but they come from a dozen different countries. You will see equal numbers of men and women, representatives of governments, representatives of NGOs, the academic community, etc. What we agreed in March was that we needed to mobilize male allies, including defense, diplomacy, development, and business leaders, to join with women and deliver messages at international organizations, ministries of defense and foreign affairs, development agencies, corporate headquarters, foundations, and NGOs. The men who would be part of this advocacy coalition would be guided by and speak with, not for, women leaders and women's organizations advocating gender justice. I'll come back in a minute to what our objectives and our next steps are going to be, but I wanted to provide a little bit of background. For me, this has been an exciting initiative. It reflects what I believe is a lifetime commitment to these issues. I've spent the last 4 decades working at the nexus of global development, diplomacy, peacemaking, and conflict resolution. I've worked on peace processes in Kenya and Sri Lanka, Afghanistan and Colombia, Haiti, and Zimbabwe. But it was my experience in Angola in the mid-1990s that served as a cautionary tale and what I'd like to call my aha moment. In 1994, I was serving at the White House as President Clinton's advisor for Africa, and I helped negotiate the end of 2 decades of civil war in Angola. And that 2 decades had left 500,000 people dead and 4 million people homeless. When the Lusaka Protocol was signed in 1994, I went to the president and asked him if I could become ambassador to Angola and to help implement the process, and he agreed. I remember that during my departure press conference, I was asked how the agreement addressed the problems of women. I thought for a second and I said, not a single accord or provision in this agreement discriminates in any way against women. I was a little too proud and I said, this agreement is gender neutral. Well, it took me only a few weeks after my arrival in Luanda in June of 1995 to realize that a peace agreement that calls itself gender neutral is by definition discriminatory against women and likely to fail. First, there were no requirements to include women in the peace implementation body called the Joint Commission. And if I hadn't have written it up there, I would have asked you the question, how many women do you think were in the room? We had 40 representatives of the government, the rebels, the United States, Portugal, Russia, and the United Nations, and not a single one was a woman. The closest we had to a woman at the table was the Russian ambassador's interpreter. And she indeed would raise her eyebrows when she heard these men talking about gender issues. But the truth is, we didn't do a lot of talking about gender issues. The imbalance silenced those voices, and so issues like sexual violence and human trafficking and reproductive health care, girls' education, and abuses of government and rebel forces were given short shrift, if any shrift at all. And as I mentioned, this notion is not uncommon. We've had recent peace agreements in Indonesia, Nepal, Somalia, Cote d'Ivoire, the Philippines, and the Central African Republic that have not had a single woman signatory, mediator, or negotiator. So the first thing we did in the peace process was to grant amnesties. We granted 13 separate amnesties for any actions that were taken during the war. There was even one amnesty which gave you a get out of jail free card for any abuse you might commit over the next 6 months. Given the prominence of sexual abuse during the conflict, what that meant was that men with guns were forgiving other men with guns for crimes against women. This action also put a cancer at the heart of our peace process and our efforts to rebuild justice and rule of law. And it showed Angolan women in particular that the peace process wasn't for them, it was for the armed combatants. The next step was to demobilize the soldiers. But when we did this, we ignored the fact that there were tens of thousands of women who had been coerced or kidnapped into the armed forces and were not eligible for demobilization. They and their children lived in shanty towns outside the demobilization camps, and this is one of them in Angola. And in particular, the women risked rape and death each time they went to collect firewoods or even to go into the woods to relieve themselves. We tried to move the demobilized soldiers back to their communities as quickly as possible, and we sent them back to their places of origin with some money, some farm seeds, and some tools. But remember, they were returning to communities that were learning and had learned to live without them during decades of civil war. And they had no skills, they had no education. And so their frustration exploded into an epidemic of alcoholism, drug abuse, divorce, domestic violence, rape, and even femicide. The end of the Civil War just meant a new and more pernicious form of violence against women. Again, this is a common phenomenon. If you look at Central America today, if you look at Afghanistan, Iraq, the end of a formal violence has resulted in actually more violence against women in these areas. And you also can think about soldiers returning to the United States from their service overseas and the problems they face. Another challenge, we had 1 million landmines planted in Angola. These landmines were planted by 13 separate armies. We even had Chevron plant landmines around their facilities in Angola. So we wanted to get our displaced people back to their homes as quickly as possible. We went out and we hired companies to come in and demine all of the roads. But even that was discriminatory against women because road clearance usually preceded the demining of fields, of wells, of schools, and forests. And as the communities went back to their homes and the men sent the women out to plant the fields and fetch water and collect firewood, they suffered a rash of injuries and death from landmine explosions. And let me stress again, if women had been at the table, they would have pointed these things out to us. There is no question in my mind. And in fact, we, after a while, recognized the problems, and we brought out gender advisors and human rights officials. We launched programs in reproductive health care and girls' education, psychosocial support for the victims of conflict. We trained soldiers and police in civilian protection. We incorporated women and women's associations in the Joint Commission, and we helped build women's civil society organizations, but it was too late. The peace process sputtered and faltered, and when we went to civil society and said, put on the government and the rebels to remain committed to this process, they laughed at us. They said, this never was our process. This was the process for the men with the guns. And frankly, peace didn't emerge until the leader of the rebels, Jonas Savimbi, was killed in a commando raid. I took these lessons from Angola with me when I left the country, and we are fortunate that these same lessons from Angola and all of the other countries that were facing conflict at the time started to be reflected in the broader movement for women's global empowerment, reflected in part at the Beijing conference in 1995. At the United Nations, new resolutions, including Resolution 1325 and its successors, created a special representative to combat violence against women. It imposed new measures of accountability. It set up structures to name, shame, and sanction offending parties. It created a single UN women's entity called UN Women. And it required all peacekeeping missions to have forceful civilian protection mandates. We saw similar exercises taking place at the African Union, NATO, the OSCE, ASEAN, the European Union, and individual countries have done the same. We also saw the Nobel Prize being given for women promoting peace and security issues, and this is Lema Gaboe, who spoke here at graduation a couple of years back, Tawakkol Karman, a Yemeni human rights, women's rights, and journalistic rights advocate, and President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia. And I guess she still is president, but she's about to leave, and hopefully you'll get her up here to speak. In the United States, we adopted a national action plan for women, peace and security. At USAID, I had the rare privilege of announcing a new program to promote women's participation in peace processes globally. And after decades of pressure, we finally enacted the Women, Peace and Security Act of 2017. But the inconvenient truth is that when you look on the ground, we are making too little collective progress. Rape is still a frequent weapon of war. The granting of impunity is too often the first step in peace processes. Women are still absent from peace tables, and resources are allocated rarely to gender-related reconstruction. Why is this the case? Well, I personally believe it's largely because men who dominate peace and security issues simply are not convinced. They need to hear these messages more frequently from women and from men. I am asked very frequently to go to the United Nations and speak with the heads of the UN peacekeeping missions before they go out to their posts. And so I speak to the special representatives, the force commanders, the police commissioners. They are all men. And I try 5 different arguments on them. First, I use the logic argument. And I find this a fascinating chart, nothing special about it. But if you think about if a peace process does not include marginalized populations, what percentage of that society actually participates in the process? And so 50% of the population are women, a quarter of the population are young, 15% have disabilities, and in many developing countries it's far more than that. The general estimate is about 10% of the population are LGBT, 8% are older people, 5% are indigenous, 1% are people with who are displaced. You add up those numbers and you get 100%. But then you do that trick about, there are some people who fit two categories and therefore, but if you exclude it and you just talk about men who are over 14, under 65, and who are not disabled, LGBT, indigenous, or displaced, 22% of the population. That's what you're excluding. You're excluding 78% of the skills and the talents of your population in a peace process. That doesn't work. I don't mean only it doesn't work in terms of the peace process, it doesn't work with these individuals. Their eyes glaze over. So then you move to a second argument, and you talk about rights and mandates. You remind them that the international community and their own countries have signed on to these international human rights conventions, that the mandate for their peacekeeping mission probably has a civilian protection component. The eyes glaze over. You then go to the fairness argument. It's just not fair. Women suffer so much in these processes, they deserve a place at the table. You start to get a little inkling with the fourth argument, which is, think of this as your wife, or your daughter, or your cousin, or your aunt, or your grandmother. And think of the suffering that they're going to go through in this process. That starts to work. So what do you think actually does work? You have any guesses? The only thing that works is when you remind them that if they are associated with a peace process that fails, it will damage their careers. It will ensure that they never get another peacekeeping mission in the future, and they will be permanently associated with failure. Then they start to perk up when you say that, and you remind them that 2/3 of peace processes, that peace processes are 2/3 more likely to fail if women aren't at the table. And then you start explaining why this is. And one of the things that destroys the peace process are ceasefire violations. If you want to know where the next ceasefire violation is going to take place, don't ask the militaries. They're not going to tell you. They don't have any interest in telling you. Go out to the marketplace and talk to the women in the marketplace whose livelihoods and lives depend upon hearing and knowing the rumors about where that next ceasefire violation is going to occur. If you want to know if your demobilization program is working, don't ask the soldiers, ask the women in the communities to which they are returning, whether they're being abused, whether the men seem to have the skills and the talents that they need to reincorporate into society. You want to know whether your security sector reform and the training of police and military is working? Don't ask the generals and don't ask the police commissioners. Ask the women who need to be protected by those forces or, in fact, are being abused by those forces. And so this is where our new initiative comes in. We are in the process, first of all, of recruiting a wide variety of senior officials in defense, diplomacy, development, the business community to participate in the process. Somebody name a number between 1 and 10. This isn't a trick question. So we are recruiting Brian Atwood, and he's already said yes to the former administrator at USAID and the Undersecretary of State. Another number. 22. 7, 9, 14, 22. Kailash Satyarthi has agreed to do this. He is the Indian child rights advocate and a Nobel laureate. For some of you, you may find this one pretty fun. George Clooney is now part of this process. Rajiv Shah, the head of Rockefeller Foundation, Tawakar Karman, who I referred to before, Wang Jisi, the dean of the School of International Studies at Beijing University, et cetera, et cetera. And we're really excited about this. These are people who have indicated an interest in participating. They haven't formally signed on yet. I need to say that because they want to see what our documents look like in most cases. And that's our next step, which is to draft a charter, a clear, concise statement of our common commitment to engendered peace processes. We are, as I said, reaching out to local organizations, in particular, grassroots advocates in conflict-related countries under the principle nothing about them without them. We have committed to bring in a number of different organizations, including the Women's Alliance for Security Leadership, the Women's Peacemakers Program, and the Women Waging Peace Network to help us address issues. As I said, the rationale and the motivation that we're using comes both from a rights-based approach, from the standpoint of gender equity, changing power dynamics in the gender area, as well as combating hypermasculinity, but it's also the utilitarian approach of ensuring that peace processes work. We're going to get the charter signed and published, and then we have commitments to meet with senior officials at the United Nations, at regional institutions, at NATO, at the U.S. National Security Council, the Pentagon, the State Department, and USAID to promote this. We will also monitor global peace negotiations, peacekeeping missions, and donor reconstruction conferences. We intend to also work with new peace operations as they're being considered at the United Nations and regional organizations. We will disseminate best practices from the experience of our advocates, as well as toolkits that exist from the Institute for Inclusive Security and the International Civil Society Action Network. And in this country, we will monitor and make sure that there is good implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security Act signed into law in October. So is it going to work? I don't know. You know, we're trying, but we've established a very clear sense of what our goals are in this, and I want to finish up with that. You know, ultimately, our success is not going to be measured in the meetings that we have or the resolutions or legislation that we help pass, the publicity we generate, or even the reports we issue. We're going to measure ourselves against time-bound measurable objectives, and the measurement will be the extent to which we protect the lives and well-being of women and girls faced with the horrors of war, the extent to which we empower them to play their rightful and vital role in peace processes and post-conflict reconstruction, our ability to prevent armed thugs from abusing them in conditions of displacement, our capacity to hold government, security forces, and warlords alike accountable for sexual abuses, the prevention of trafficking and traffickers from turning women and children into commodities, our ability to build solid civil society networks for women, and our ability to end the stigmatization and the victimization associated with women who want to step forward and be peace leaders. I know this is a tall task, but we've asked ourselves, if not us, who? And if not now, when? Thank you. and let's talk about it. Yes, please.
Can I ask a question about the evidence that you're pointing to in terms of peacekeeping and
Yep.
getting stronger? It's discussed a lot increasingly, which is good, but in terms of concrete discussion of which studies show what, whatever.
Texas A&M, the Bush Center, has done extensive research, taking 300 separate agreements and walking through them step by step. New York University has done the same thing under the remarkable Anne-Marie Goetz. We have the Columbia University has just established a Peace and Women's Initiative Center, which has done fabulous research. The Georgetown Center for Women, Peace, and Security has done this research. UN Women itself has produced research. It's undeniable. I mean, you can look at this data and you get a clear, not only a statistical and a totally verified congruence, but the logic train is there too. And so they will point out, for example, that a peace process falls apart if there are too many ceasefire violations. And then they will show that the way to find out where that violation is going to take place is by talking to women. They will show that political pressure from women, as well as other civil society groups, so marginalized populations, academics, lawyers, that is essential to keeping a peace process on track if it starts to falter. And they can show that women in particular will not put pressure on leadership if they do not believe the process is supportive of them personally. So this is not, again, we have long known this, but again, we have, people who I think use it mostly as an excuse. Well, this is all anecdotal evidence. It's not verifiable and research-oriented, but it is. The person who probably is the best in the world at this is Valerie Hudson at Texas A&M, the Bush Center. She also wrote this remarkable book called The Hillary Doctrine, which basically says we need to engender our entire foreign policy. And, the Swedes are taking that even more seriously. They are adopting what they call a feminist foreign policy, looking at all the issues that play in foreign affairs from a gender perspective. And I had the opportunity to go to Sweden and to be part of the team that was analyzing how do you put a gender perspective on the Iran nuclear deal? How do you put a gender perspective on nukes in North Korea? How do you put gender perspective on climate change issues? And the truth is you can. And in fact, you have to, because they are engendered issues. Please.
So sort of related to what you just said, do you see this as a problem of just whether or not women have a seat at the table in terms of negotiations for peace processes, or more as a historical construction of a particular type of international relations that has happened over time and developed because of that?
So the short answer is I believe the latter, but I'm also an incrementalist as an individual. I believe you make positive change at the micro level, so you get more women at the peace table. And it's not just individual women, it's got to be a critical mass of women, because if not, they frankly act exactly like their male colleagues would, or they are cowed from making the points that they need to make. Generally, we talk about that being 20 to 30% as a critical mass. And frankly, that comes from sociology experiments that have been done. If you are a 20% minority at a table, you begin to have the confidence to express your views and to have solidarity with other individuals, as opposed to people turning to you and saying, so, Hillary, what do women think on these issues? Which is too frequently the case. I do believe the latter, however, your second point, which is that we have, in fact, said that gender-related issues or issues that are social or economic are the soft issues. And, Dan Benjamin worked the hard issues at the State Department, but Dan Benjamin understood that the hard issues often have their basis in what we call soft issues. And that it's important to be able to address issues of trafficking in persons and criminal networks and other issues that don't rise to the top of a foreign policy agenda but should be there. I participated in a lot of meetings at the National Security Council of the Deputies Committee, and you'd have an agenda for an hour-long discussion, and usually the sixth or seventh issue was something that related to women or socioeconomic issues or something of that nature, and you'd never get there in the course of the discussion. I, for one, believe that these issues of women's engagement and empowerment are equally as important as climate change, as nukes in North Korea, as any of the harder issues that we think are on the table. Dan?
Since I've been cited.
Positively.
Yes, no, so you have focused your talk pretty much exclusively on the issue of ending conflict and women's roles in ending conflict. And though I don't have anything like the depth you have on the issue, when we discussed this at state, in lots of different contexts, there were lots of other sub-issues or related issues and the sort of women, peace, and security agenda having to do with women's empowerment in conflict zones, in village settings, in terms of countering violent extremism and the like. And I was wondering if you just want to touch on a few of those issues.
Sure, and let me say again, I am both narrow-visioned and incrementalist. And so we have had so many people say, hey, you've got all these incredible leaders, you've got Ban Ki-moon, you've got Kofi Annan and George Clooney. Why are you being so narrow? Why are you just focusing on this one area? Well, because I think we'll get lost if we go bigger. So I haven't talked a lot about Me Too movement and, the power relationships, which is one of the things you're addressing. They are important. There's no question about that. But I believe that you make progress where you can and you effectuate change. And let me say, I think they're related. So our class this year is focusing in part on Uganda. And Uganda, to me, is a fascinating case of this, because if you look at the Acholi people in northern Uganda, they are a matriarchal society. They are a society where power is wielded by women. And they are the ones who are the de facto mayors, the de facto heads of courts, etc. And the society works very effectively. So then you get the Lord's Resistance Army coming in and a war emerging. And then you get a national peace process on the LRA, and women are not there. And this is their community. If you look at the Kitgum, Women's Association, it is one of the most powerful local organizations. And yet when you take it to the national level, it's like, okay, now the men folk come in and they take over, and Museveni, negotiates with Coney and, all the rest. And it is absolutely crazy. For me, the importance of getting into those communities and empowering those women to play a larger political role in their country is absolutely vital. And it relates to every factor you can imagine. It relates to domestic violence. It relates to the return of refugees from the Lord's Resistance Army. It relates to child soldiers, et cetera. And for me, what's really important in that environment is to apply the same lenses at national and global levels that we do in those small situations. I also believe that it is possible to incorporate what, again, going back to the point of soft issues, into the work that you do or you did at the State Department. And that is to say, it's all about understanding the power dynamics and relationships, being able to identify who is a leader in a process, who is a supporter, who is an ally. And in the general area that we're talking about here, again, it's absolutely vital to understand that the men in the process are very unlikely to yield power unless they see a personal interest in it. And I think that applies right across the board. Please.
In terms of academic research, what are some areas that you don't think have been looked at so much that you think are important?
What I have never figured out is the motivational factors. How do you actually encourage change? And I've given you my vision because I try to deal with these force commanders and these police commissioners from various different standpoints. But that's never been done in a formal way. This whole thing is based upon the notion that a theory of the case, which is that if General John Allen, who just retired from the Pentagon and is one of the most respected generals that there is now a true believer in women's participation in the process. If he goes back and communicates with his former colleagues, that the scales will fall from their eyes and they can see. It suggests that businessmen walk in and say to other businessmen, put pressure on your government because if women aren't part of this process, we're not going to make any money in this environment. It says to aid workers, Brian Atwood, go in and talk to, Mark Green now, who is the head of AID, and remind him that if women are not empowered to play their proper role. But this is guesswork. We're assuming this is the case. So I'd like to get more actual evidence in that area. And let me say, I think it's possible with the new techniques that we're adopting that are quantifying what are normally considered to be qualitative factors. And by that I mean, for example, we have, and this is going a little bit afield, we have long wondered at AID whether economic growth per se is empowering for a society vis-a-vis women. It's a very interesting question. If you get high growth rates, is that generally empowering for women? And we've never been able to find the answers to that. And so we developed at AID something called the Women's Agricultural Empowerment Index. And you go into communities, and we went into, to get this going, we went into West Africa and we went into Central America. And we were trying to determine if increases in farm income empowered women or disempowered women. And so you walk in and you look and you see who is speaking at town hall meetings. Is it men or is it women? And if women are speaking, do people pay attention? And you quantitatively mark that. You determine who has the deeds for the land. And does that transfer to men alone or does it go to women? You look at issues related to where you decide to sell your products and who's making those decisions. And as a result, you can then over time determine whether this is empowering or disempowering. And you get some interesting results. In West Africa, economic growth in the rural sector is empowering for women. In Central America, it's disempowering. Because frankly, in Central America, the notion is that once it reaches a certain level, the men take it over. And the men resent women's ownership of property and the additional resources coming in to that area. And you will get more cases of domestic violence from women trying to take over in these areas than you could ever imagine. And so I would love someone to do the research that says, okay, who are the true believers? Who are the people who are acting properly? And what was the motivation for them? In my case, it came really early on. When I was 17 years old and graduated high school, my parents got me a lifetime membership in the National Organization for Women. I wanted a car, but, I took what I could get. And frankly, I always remember Shirley Chisholm coming to speak to my graduation and talking about having experienced more prejudice in her life as a woman than as an African American. And so, I had early aha moments, but those are individual. What motivates those people? One of the leaders in this movement is a man, Anwar Chaudhry. He was the Bangladesh ambassador to the United Nations in 2000 when the United Nations passed this remarkable resolution, 1325. I've gone back and looked, and his entire history indicates someone who you would expect would be sexist, misogynist, certainly not sympathetic to this issue. And he actually was the president of the Security Council when the resolution passed. And you can hear his comments change as he heard the people coming in to make the arguments to him. What was there in him that allowed this transformation? Why is it receptive in some environments and not in others? I don't know the answer, and I'd love to get some research into that. Please.
There's been such emphasis in the last few years on the education of women in third world countries, but reading between the lines of what you're saying, it sounds as though the men need to understand the advantage to them for women to be educated.
So,
what is being done about that?
Yeah, so that's a remarkably successful story that we don't hear about very frequently. In most countries around the world, the expansion of girls' education has been remarkable over the course of the last 25 years. In many countries, we've even gotten to the point where there's pure equity at the elementary, secondary, and at the university level. There is a higher percentage of women than men. It's a remarkable movement. We still have a long way to go. I'm not saying that this issue has been resolved, but I think there is, in the economic development area, a broad recognition that girls' education is the single best investment that you can make in addressing poverty, in improving agricultural outcomes, in encouraging proper health. There's some statistics that are just amazing that we've gone over in our class that talk about for every additional year that a girl stays in school, her income rises by 7% over her lifetime. Her likelihood of giving birth to many children declines from 5 per woman to 2.2 per woman if you complete high school. You are more likely to use your education to improve the health of your family. And frankly, you're more likely to succeed economically and use effectively the resources that are available to your family. We have seen tremendous progress. That said, there are real challenges, and the challenges occur primarily at the secondary school level, where parents have to make a decision as to who, given school fees and given uniforms that have to be bought, how to use your scarce income, and generally the decision is to go with your boy rather than your girl, and that's a real challenge. We also have very serious problems in terms of adolescent girls when they go through menstruation. They are embarrassed to go to school. There are no latrines that are possible, etc. Equally, if you are a disabled girl, basically you are out of luck. There is this incredible statistic that some 80% of young girls with disabilities are not in school in developing countries. And so there are challenges remaining, but I think it is generally accepted that girls' education is the single best investment that a government can make, that a society can make, and it is improving. Yes?
Do you find that there is a correlation between the gender of a head of state and the relative peacefulness of a head of state during the term?
The old Golda Meir, Maggie Thatcher question. It's a great question. And the short answer is no, there's not really a relationship between gender and conflict in that level. And it's in large part because women who have risen in a male-dominated, male-oriented structure often are imitative or frankly have those beliefs, and as we've always said, it's easier, it's a Richard Nixon going to China. It's always easier for a woman from a conservative bent to navigate the agenda better than a woman from the liberal side. That said, I'd love you to take a look at the Swanee Hunt article in Foreign Affairs about 4 years ago, because her argument is, and this is analytical again, empirical, this is not just argumentation. She's gone in and looked at the budgets of parliaments that are dominated by men and those that are more equitable. And they tend to spend a hell of a lot more money on social issues, on health and education and housing, than on military issues. And you can do the statistics and you can control for all the different factors. Corruption is less, and women just aren't as corrupt. I'm sorry to say it, but it's actually true, according to these statistics. You can see stability in those countries tends to be greater. Reactions from military and police to disturbances locally tends to be different. So it's a tough argument, but in terms of actual warfare and conflict, the Falklands, I guess, was under Maggie Thatcher and Golda Meir, and Gandhi and all the, you really can't make that correlation, or at least I've never seen it. So, which is not to say that women aren't inherently more peaceful. But I'm not going to get into that whole area. I learned my lesson a long time ago. Dan?
Well, just as a footnote, on the corruption side, I put that as your without any of them. But moving along, I'm curious, what is the, so you flashed a lot of very impressive organizations up on the board, and impressive people too. What is the grassroots agenda in this space?
So
Other
the-
than electing more women to Congress.
So the grassroots agenda in this space, where am I going? Is this one.
Yeah.
Because the truth is, if we did this as an elitist structure, we would fail. Our job is to open doors for people at the grassroots level who are affected by conflict to walk in and make the argumentation. We are door openers. We are validators. We are tourist guides saying, okay, when you make this argument, you got to focus on this. I had a very strange experience. I was Bill Clinton's advisor for fighting landmines. And this was at a time when we were spending more money to fight landmines than any other country on earth, but we were not signing the treaty. And we had activists from developing countries, mine-affected countries, come, and they would go in, and this was both under Madeleine Albright and under Colin Powell. And they would make arguments that came from weird places that Colin Powell would look at them and say, I don't get what you're saying. I don't understand. You need a tour guide. You need someone who's going to say, here are the advocacy points. I remember Heather Mills and Paul McCartney coming in to see the president, and Secretary of State. And Heather Mills said, General Powell, I know you're not a coward like everyone says you are. I know you're not afraid of not having landmines. I know, yeah. And Powell just sort of looked at her and said, who the hell briefed you? You know, and then Paul McCartney said, Mr. Secretary, we can work it out. And Secretary Powell said, yeah, try and see it my way. So, I mean, it was like, that was great, and he obviously knew how to connect. But that's part of our effort here. The other thing is that the messages that we would be communicating have to come from the grassroots level. They have to have the poignancy. You know, one of my wife's jobs during that landmine period was something called Raising the Voices, which was the international campaign to ban landmines effort to take individuals from the field who had been impacted by landmines, who had blown legs off or whatever, and make sure that they could communicate at that level, because they have the power. You know, if Don Steinberg goes in and talks to, the current deputy administrator at AID, it has none of the power as a woman who has, from Eastern Congo or Northern Uganda or Colombia, who says, my peace process is going to fall apart because you're not engaged in women in these processes. So that's part of it. The other thing that I did not get to is that once we're down the road, we will become a funding conduit for resources to these grassroots organizations in the field. Right now, we are fully funded, and it really feels nice to be able to say that. We have several foundations that are supportive. We've gone with lesser foundations because we didn't want the overhang. So Ford Foundation, has basically said, we'll help you. And we said, nah, we're not sure. You've got, a long history, a long past. We talked with the Carter Center. They want to support it. And we said, we'd love you to be a partner, but we don't want the support. So we've gone to institutions that are very small. But when we take it to that next level, when we are the conduit for the Ford Foundations and the Joan Kroc Institutes and the Rockefellers, then we are going to start channeling resources to women-led grassroots organizations to empower them. Please.
I'm curious to why the focus So you mentioned the 5 reasons that you try to convince and to invite or let women to the table. Instead of that focus, or why is the focus on that versus like clearing political channels so that women can get elected by their constituents or people in their communities?
For this initiative, it is a very, as I said before, very narrowly focused initiative trying to, I'm sorry? Oh. Actually, I think it's this one.
I don't know which one's working. On the podium.
Oh, I'm sorry. So in this area, it is a very narrowly focused effort to change peace processes. I fully agree that the broader initiative of changing power dynamics in the economic and the political and security environment is absolutely necessary. And so, but there are groups, he for she, UN Women, Men Engage worldwide, women, the equivalent of an Emily's List around the world. There are initiatives in those spaces. We're trying to fill a very different niche here. And the advantage in this space is that we have very clear goals: 30% women's participation in peace processes, an expansion to at least 15% of actual resources going to post-conflict reconstruction, going to gender-related issues, encouragement of peacekeeping mandates that are sensitive to gender. You can measure it. The issues that you're addressing go well beyond that, and equally important, but just different.
As a follow-up, is there any punishment or sanction, like anything that would happen if those goals are not met, or is it just kind of a project of measuring how this?
That's a very good question, and it's something that has been raised by a number of the people that you saw on that, on this list. I have at least 7 people who have said, so what happens when we go in and we argue for these things and they say, hey, that's nice, and then they go on their way? There has to be at some point a sanction, a individual accountability for this. But as a group of civil society actors, as a group of former politicians, former generals, it's very hard to implement that. You can do, political power, but a lot of these individuals are not politically motivated. When you go in and talk to the head of peacekeeping affairs, Department of Peacekeeping Operations at the United Nations, he wasn't elected. So you have very little pressure. You have the naming and shaming, but no, that doesn't tend to yield results, and therefore you have to argue on the basis of the power of your actual arguments. So you have to be able to say, in Colombia, involving women in the peace process will do the following for you, blank, 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 blank. And this is where we have toolkits that have been prepared. This is where you have to do it on a retail basis. You have to do it process by process. And you have to draw on those relationships. And I downplayed the influence that I can have with my predecessor at AID, or my predecessor as the head of African Affairs, but they have asked to see us. And they've said, yeah, something's not working here. And when we say, well, one of the things that isn't working is you do not have engendered peace processes, they say, well, come and talk to me. And so, and even in the Trump administration, they're saying, come and talk to me, which I find intriguing. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much.